So for these handle ears, I was planning to extrude it and then curve it all the way to the top, but then that didn't really work well in my mind. What really works well is just extruding all the way to like the left or the right, and I did all the way to the left here, and then just extrude all the way to the top. That way we have a rectangular plane. It's just over the entire reference, and I drag the edges all the way to the left to make sure we get the entire reference. And then from here, I just did a whole bunch of loop cuts in the columns. And again, I'm trying to make this as even as possible. So you can determine why I did that, because I'm looking at the little squares at the bottom for my quads. Because when I do another loop cut in the rows, we can actually get everything to be super even with all the little squares. And that makes a lot of sense. And that keeps everything aligned and organized. That's just how my brain thinks now for most of my sketches. And then I get rid of the dead space for all the other squares that aren't touching the reference at all. And you can visually see that. It makes a lot of sense. You can delete those faces. And then any one of them that is still touching the reference, just keep it there. And then we can just cut those out with the knife tool. And then that makes the entire process much smoother and intuitive. At least for me it is. I don't even know if I'm explaining it right, but hopefully you guys understand. And I've started doing this recently with my previous characters. Just makes a lot more sense to do that. And towards the head, this whole middle part, we can just delete all these faces and just think about how a handle would look like and try your best to visualize that. Even with the sketch, you might not be able to, but just try your best. So I'm just essentially creating the shape, and then all the edge loops is how I'm going to pull out the shape for the 3D shape. And I've been doing that manually just so that I understand how to do that. It makes a lot more sense. If you have a whole bunch of 2D objects that you want to make, you got to understand how it becomes from 2D to 3D, because you're actually pulling everything out from a flat surface. You just have to understand how that process is. That's why I do it the hard way first and then do it the easier way later on. And then for the rest of this, I'm going to be using the knife tool to cut out the rest of the dead space. And if you have close vertices next to each other, you can definitely just wield them together. Makes a lot more sense to do that. There's really no reason to have two close vertices like that if you're trying to create a curve around your geometry. And this is pretty self-explanatory on how to create curves with your shapes, just knifing and deleting the faces, and then aligning any vertices that you see as best as you can to the reference. I've actually been using this method a lot. It just clicked for me one day that, oh, okay, this is how I should have been doing the plane method. It's just more organized, makes more sense when I'm explaining the videos, super easy to follow, especially if you want to create any 3D models from anything. You can pretty much do it for any type of sketch or any object that you would like. It's entirely up to you.